Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today in this video we are going to discuss real Salesforce interview question answers asked in the KPMG company, KPMG India. These questions were asked in the L1 technical round and these are mainly targeted for the Salesforce developers interview. Now important thing is in the interview they do not check whether you know or whether you know the concept or not. They will check how you can explain the answer, how you can technically stand and communicate with the questions, also how you can tackle the questions technically. So in this video I will not just give short answers. I will explain how you should answer the questions in the interview. So if you are preparing for the companies like KPMG, Deloitte, Accenture, Capgemini, TCS, this video will be very helpful for you. So let's get started. Question number one: what all integrations have you done in the your project? This is very common question in the Salesforce interview, especially for the developers who have worked on the real project. When interviewer asks this question, they are trying to understand your real project exposure. So instead of giving the theoretical answer, always explain what integrations you actually work on. In most enterprise projects, Salesforce does not work alone. It usually integrates with the other systems like ERP, payment gateway, marketing tools, and internal enterprise application. In my project, I mainly worked on REST API based integration. In this type of integration, Salesforce communicate with the external system using HTTP callouts. The typical flow looks like this. Salesforce sends the request to external system using REST API. The external system process the request and send back to the Salesforce. Then Salesforce process the response and update the record accordingly. For example, one of the common scenario is payment gateway integration. Suppose customer is ultimately uh, customer is ultimately processing the payment and send the transaction detail to the Salesforce. Salesforce then updates the opportunity or the order records with the payment status. In our project, we implemented this integration using HTTP callouts. So also we have used name credentials and custom metadata for managing the API endpoints. Another type of integration we worked on was inbound integration. Inbound integration is sometimes used for external systems send data into the Salesforce. Now, for example, lead creation from the marketing tools, multiple marketing tools like HubSpot and others, right, sends the leads that needed to get created into the Salesforce. Also, order records from the ERP needs to generate in the Salesforce. This can be done using the inbound integration. Then we have SOAP integration. Now, SOAP integration is very important, used mainly when dealing with the legacy enterprise system. Salesforce cannot generate the Apex class from WSDL or WSDL to Apex. Here we can use the SOAP integration. We can also use the middleware integration. For complex integration, middleware such as MuleSoft or Boomi is used. External systems are connected to middleware and middleware is connected to the Salesforce, and a middleware can act the bridge in between the Salesforce as well as external system. So this is the all integration that I have performed in my recent project. Somehow like this you can answer to the question. Now question number two is, have you done any POC? Now, what is mean by POC, guys? POC stands for proof of concept. Proof of concept usually done before implementing full solution. to check whether the technical approach will work or not. For example, a company wanted to integrate the Salesforce with new payment gateway. Before starting the full development, the team may create the small prototype of the test, or simply we can test that integration if it is working properly with the Salesforce or not. You can say that in my recent project, we created a POC for payment API integration. The main goal of POC was to validate the few things. First, we need to check whether the Salesforce cloud successfully connect to the external API. Second, we need to verify authentication mechanism used by the API. Third, we need to validate the request and response structure. So the steps we followed were, the first step is we studied the API documentation provided by the external system. Then we configured the name credential in the Salesforce for the authentication. After that, we created the simple Apex callout class that sent a request to API endpoint. Once we received the response, we logged the response data and verified whether the data structure was correct or not. If POC works successfully, then team finalize the architect and development approach for the full integration. So in interview, if you worked on the POC, explain what problem you were trying to validate, what steps you followed, and what was the outcome. This shows your problem solving approach, which interviewers really like. The next question is, how deployment is done in the current project, deployment tool you worked on. Now, deployment is very important part of the Salesforce deployment or development, because we usually work in the multiple environments. We usually works on developer sandbox, QA or UAT sandbox, or production. In smaller project, deployment is usually done using the change set. In this approach, developer create the change set in the sandbox and send it to the target environment. The deployment flow generally looks like developer sandbox to UAT, UAT to production. However, in the modern project, many companies follows the DevOps practices. In these environments, we use the Git for the version controlling. Developer push their code to the Git repository, and then CI/CD pipeline automatically deploys the changes. Common CI/CD tools used in the Salesforce like Jenkins, GitHub Action, and Azure DevOps. Typically, the pipeline looks like a developer commits the code to the Git. The CI system runs, validate the check, and execute the test classes. If everything passes, the code is deployed to the target environment. This approach improves deployment speed, code quality, version control, and team collaboration. So in interview, always mention both change set and CI/CD pipeline, because many companies are moving towards the DevOps implementation. Difference between query locator and iterable. This question is related to the batch epics. In the batch epics, the start method is used to define the set of records that the batch job will process. There are two ways to provide the records to the batch job. First is query locator, second is iterable. Let's understand the both. First, query locator is used when you wanted to fetch the record directly from the Salesforce using the SOQL query. For example, you wanted to process all accounts record, you can directly write SOQL query like select ID from account. The important advantage of query locator is that it can handle very large volume of the data. It can process up to 50 million, means 5 crore records. Salesforce internally manages how records are divided into smaller batches because this is a query locator, because of the query locator. Now let's talk about the iterable. Iterable is used when the data does not comes directly from the SOQL query. For example, you batch jobs needs to process the data coming from the external API. In this case, many first retrieve the data. Means in this case, you might first retrieve the data and store in the custom collection. Then you can pass the collection to the batch job using the iterable. So the main difference is query locator is used when data comes from the Salesforce object through SOQL. Iterable is used when data comes from the custom sources or custom logic. In most real projects, developer mostly use query locator because it optimized for the large data processing. Now, next question is in UAT test class, the code coverage is 85%, but while deploying to production, it is getting failed, showing 0% code coverage. What was a reason? What can be a reason? So this is actually very practical scenario based question. Many developers face this issue during the deployment. If code coverage in UAT is around 85, but while deploying to the production, if it is showing 0%, then there can be few possible reasons. The first possible reason is test class were not included in the deployment, because we need to include the test class while deploying. Sometimes developer deploy only Apex class or triggers but forget to include the corresponding test class in the deployment package. In that case, Salesforce will not run the test properly and coverage may appear zero. The second reason could be uh, your test class is dependent on the existing data in the UAT. For example, suppose your test class queries the record like select ID from account where name equals to test. If the record exists in UAT but does not exist in production, then test will fail in the production. That's why Salesforce strongly recommends not depending on the existing org data. Another common issue is use of see all data equal to true. If your test class is written with the see all data enabled or see all data equal to true, it may believe uh, it may behave differently in the different environment. The best practice is always create your own test data inside the test class. For example, instead of querying the existing records, you should create the record inside the test class. You create an account record, insert it, and run your logic or your test logic on the record that you have created. This makes your test class independently and reliable across the environment. So whenever you face the situation, always check are the test class includes in the deployment. Is the test class dependent on the existing data? Is see all data being used? And we can fix accordingly. The next question is batch running fine in the UAT. In production, we are getting the error too many query rows 50001, right? Why and how to resolve it? This problem usually happens because the production data volume is much larger than the UAT data. Salesforce has the governor limit that restrict the number of records that can be retrieved by the SOQL in the single transaction. The limit is 50,000 records. Okay. If you query more than that, then Salesforce throws the error. Too many query rows, right? 50,001. Now, in UAT, you might have only few hundreds or few thousand records. So the batch will work properly in the UAT, unit testing environment. But in production, the same object might have hundreds of or thousands of or even billions of records. Because of this, the query may exceed and governor limits also may exist. There are several ways to solve this issue. First approach is use database.queryLocator in the batch apex. QueryLocator can process 50 million up to 50 million records. So it is designed for the large data processing. The second approach is add filtering condition in your query. Instead of querying all the records, you should process only required records. For example, you might filter the record based on the status date or some specific criteria. The third and important best practice is to avoid unnecessary queries inside the loop. Queries inside loop can quickly increase the number of rows processed. So whenever you are designing the batch apex class or batch job, always think of large volume data, especially when the code is running in the production. The next question is, what is the best practices of the test classes? Now, test class is extremely important in the Salesforce because no code can be deployed without sufficient test coverage. Salesforce requires at least 75% code coverage, but real project is usually aims to get 85% or higher. Once we get 85 in enterprise project, we can push the data or we can push the code to the production. One of the most important best practice is never depend on the existing org data. Your test should be created or should create all the required record within the test class itself. It ensures that the test runs successfully in the every environment. Another important best practice is use of test.start test and test.stop test. This method resets the governance limit and also ensures that asynchronous processes like batch apex, queuable jobs, and future methods get executed during the test. You should also test both positive and negative scenarios. Positive scenarios mean valid data, and negative scenario means invalid data. Another good practice is create the test data factory class. A test data factory is reusable class that can create the test records like account, contact, opportunity. Instead of writing the same record creation code again and again, developers can simply call the factory method inside the test class. This improves the maintainability and readability of the test class. So overall, good test class should have independent, means it should not be dependent on the org's data, reusable. We should create the test data factory, cover multiple scenarios, negative as well as positive, and easy to maintain. Now the next question is parent to child and child to parent communication. This question is related to Lightning Web Component in LWC. Component to component communication with each and other can be happen in the two ways, actually in the three ways. But if the components are related to each other, then it can happen in the two ways. The first type is parent to child component communication. In this approach, the parent component sends the data to the child component. This is done using the property decorators or decorated by the header API. The parent component passes the data to the child component and the child component receives and displays that data. This is commonly used when parent component controls the data and the child component is responsible for displaying it. The second type is child to parent component communication. In this case, the child component needs to send information back to the parent. This is done using the custom events. The child component fires an event and the parent component listens to that event. When the parent receives the event, it can update its data or performance for some or perform some actions. For example, suppose child component update a record. After updating a record, child fires and custom events to notify the parent. The parent can refreshes the data to reflect the large changes or latest changes. This event this event-based communication help to maintain the loose or coupling between the components, which is considered a good design practice in the component communication. Next question is explain the track and the wire and use case for the both. In the Lightning Web component, both track and wire are related to handling a data on UI. Let's talk about the track. In earlier versions of LWC, track is used to make object properties reactive. This means whenever the value of the property changes, the UI automatically re-renders. However, in the modern LWC version, most primitive fields are reactive by default. So there is no requirement of track. Track mainly requires when dealing with the objects and array mutations. For example, if you modify the property inside an object, track will ensure that the UI detects the changes and updates accordingly. Now let's talk about @wire. @wire decorator is used to fetch the data from the Salesforce. It can help it can help us for Apex calling Apex method in the LWC component or Lightning data services. The major advantage of wire is that it is reactive in nature. If parameters are used in the if parameters used in the wire method changes, the wire method automatically execute again or renders again. Another benefit is that when we mark Apex method catchable, the result can be cached, which improves the performance of the system. A common use case of wire is automatically loading the data when component initializes. For example, when the component loads, it may fetch the list of accounts using the wire method. So in simple terms, track is related to the reactive data updates in the UI. Wire is used to reactive data from Salesforce and keep UI synchronized with the data sources like the Salesforce basically, right? Now we have to discuss the very common question. Question number 10, best practices of LWC. When the interview asked about the best practices of Lightning Web component, they wanted to check whether you understand how to build a scalable and maintainable UI components in Salesforce or not. One of the most important best practice is to use Lightning data services whenever is possible. Lightning data services allows us to retrieve the data, update the Salesforce record using or without writing the Apex code. This improves the performance and also reduce the server call. Another best practice is to avoid unnecessary Apex call. Sometimes developer write Apex method for operations that can actually handled by the Lightning data services. So before writing the Apex, always check whether the standard LDS Lightning data services functionality can solve the problem or not. Another good practice is using catchable Apex method. When you mark the Apex method as a catchable, Salesforce can store the response in the browser cache. This improves the performance and reduce repeated server calls. Another important best practice is component reusability. Instead of creating one of or instead of creating one very large component, it is better to divide the UI into the smaller reusable component. This improves the maintainability and makes debugging easier. Always make sure to handle the errors properly in the LWC. Uh, User should not see the blank screens when the error occur. Instead of that, they should see some message using the those notifications. And finally, avoid heavy DOM manipulation because LWC worked on the reactive framework. Directly DOM manipulation can sometimes cause the unexpected behavior. So overall, The good LWC development focus on the performance, reusability, clean component structure, and proper error handling. Now, the next cross question is error handling in LWC. Error handling is very important in any application because of failures can happen at multiple level. In LWC, we generally handles errors in the three layers. First is the apex layer, second is a try catch block layer. First is a apex layer, second is a JavaScript layer, and third is a UI layer. In the apex layer, we use try catch block and return meaningful error message. In JavaScript layer, we handle the promise feature, right? We create the promise failures, right? And displays the errors to the users. And in UI layer, we use the toast message to inform users about the failures. This ensures the better user experience and easier debugging. Now the question number 12 is best practices of the triggers, right? So whenever we are writing the triggers, we must follow few principles. First is always write one trigger per object. Always use trigger handler class. Always use the handler class for the trigger. Always approach the bulkification of the code. Always write the logic to test bulkified data. Never perform the SOQL queries inside the loop, right? Avoid recursion. Use static Boolean variable to prevent the recursion of the trigger execution and follow separation concern. Business logic should be inside the Apex class, which is a handler class, instead of directly putting it into the triggers. Now, question number 13 is before doing any kind of integration, what all things you will keep in mind and what will be your approach. When we design an integration between the Salesforce and another system, we need to consider several important factors. The first thing to consider is authentication. We need to understand how external system authenticates the request. Common authentication mechanism includes OAuth 2.0 and API keys and token based authentication. The second factor is security. All integrations should securely communicate or secure and communication protocols like HTTP. It should we should ensure data is transmitted through the HTTP request only, HTTPS request only. Sensitive information such as tokens, credentials should never be stored in directly inside the code. Instead of Salesforce recommends we should have a name credential in the Salesforce and we should store the sensitive information right into the name credential. The third important factor is data mapping. We need to understand how data fields in the Salesforce corresponds to the fields in the external system. Proper mapping ensures that data is transferred correctly. Another important consideration is error handling. External system may sometimes fails or respond slowly, so we need the mechanism for relying or retrying the request or logging the failures. This brings to another important aspect which is called as login. Login means simply creating the log object of the integration logs object in the Salesforce, and whenever something went wrong, this object can store the details such as request payload, response payload, and error message. Finally, we should consider the governing limits also. The large integrations should be implemented using the asynchronous processes like queuable apex and avoid hitting limits. So the good integration design is focused on the security, reliability, scalability, and maintainability. The question number 14 that we have is what is a record trigger flow? So record trigger flow is automatically run when record changes. They are commonly used in the business process automation. Record trigger flow runs on a record creation, record updation, and record deletion. There are two main types of record trigger flow: before save and after save flow. Before before save flow are mainly used for updating fields on the same record before it saved to the database. These are very fast and efficient. Second type is after save flow. After save flow runs after the records committed to the database. They are used for when we are performing actions like creating related record, updating other object, and sending the notification. Record trigger flows are increasingly replacing the workflows, rules, and process builder because flows are more powerful and flexible than the legacy tools. Next is what is mixed DML error and how can mixed DML error fix. Mixed DML error occurs when we try to perform DML operation on setup objects and non-setup objects in the same transaction. Setup objects like user, profile, permission set, non-setup objects like account, contact, opportunity. Now, Salesforce does not allow both type of operations in the same transaction because of security and data consistency reason. For example, if we try to create the user and account in the same transaction, Salesforce will throw mixed DML error. To fix this issue, we need to separate this operation into different transactions. This can be done using asynchronous processing. The common solution includes future method, queuable method, and batch apex. By moving one of the operation into asynchronous process, we can ensure that both operation run separately as a transaction. The question number 16 that we have is how to prevent the mixed DML error in the record trigger flow. Now, when mixed DML error occurs in the flow, the solution is similar. We need to separate the transaction. One approach is to use asynchronous path in the flow. Asynchronous path runs after main transaction is completed, which prevents the mix DML issue. Another approach is using the platform events. Platform events create the separate transaction, which helps avoid mixed DML conflicts. The third approach is calling asynchronous apex method from the flow. For example, the flow can invoke a queuable apex that perform the setup object operation separately. By separating the transactions, we prevent the mixed DML error while keeping the automation working correctly. So these were the L1 technical round question asked in the KPMG Salesforce interview. If you are preparing for the Salesforce developer role, understanding this concept clearly will help you to perform better in the interview. In the next video, we will cover In the next video, we will cover L2 technical or techno managerial round of interview questions asked in the same KPMG company, where the interviewer asks more scenario based and architecture focused question. So make sure to watch the next video as well. And if you found the video helpful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel for the more Salesforce interview preparation content. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next video.